So let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It is our tremendous pleasure to welcome you all in this session. Thank you for joining our virtual lecture with our guest speaker, Professor Paddock from George Washington University. I'm Aubin Nzaou, and I'm a researcher at the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center. But I'm mostly thrilled to kick off our today's session as part of our monthly guest speaker series on energy transition and climate governance, which convenes speakers to address topics related to many challenges of our time as regards energy law and policy, low carbon economy, and climate governance. Our program on non-state actors, energy transition and climate governance at the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center is founded by the European Commission in the frame of the program H2020 and Marie Curie Actions. So we are delighted to partner with the Center of US and Mexican Law here at the University of Houston Law Center and the Center for European Studies at Jean Moulin University of Lyon in France to conduct research on diverse topics related inter alia to non-state actors and climate litigation under the inspiring leadership of Professor Victor Flatt, co-director of the EENR Center with Professor Gina Warren, but also our chair this morning. So feel free to visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/EENR Center. Our series will also feature the following guest speakers. February 16th, 2021, Professor Alexandra Klass, University of Minnesota Law School, who will discuss eminent domain law as climate policy. March, Professor Joshua Galperin from University of Pittsburgh School of Law, who will discuss a topic about uncommon law, judging in the Anthropocene. April, Professor Uma Utka from the University of Kansas School of Law will discuss about energy law and environment. May, Professor Rebecca Bradsby from the CUNY School of Law will discuss a topic about environmental law. And in June, Professor Lisa Benjamin from Lewis and Clark Law School will discuss a topic about companies and climate change. So now it's my pleasure to hand it over to you, Victor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aubin. I am really happy to be here and happy with the program. We are so excited to have this series of webinars through the Transition in Law and Governance project to move to a less wasteful and less climate-intensive future. On behalf of my co-director, Gina Warren, and I, EENR welcomes you to that. Part of that future comes under the moniker of greening the supply chain. And this moniker is one of many that recognizes that there are many steps in the production and distribution of goods, and that it is important to look at all of these steps. And that's especially true since laws don't cover everything, and at least in the United States, have proven more difficult to amend. And we have an international, interconnected system of supplies, products. Many resources and much power exist now in private companies who make and influence regulation in this area. Part of private environmental governance, which the environmental law section, securities law section, will also be exploring at this year's American Association of Law Schools annual meeting. Today, addressing the topic that he has researched and written about is Lee Paddock, Professor Paddock from George Washington University School of Law. Professor Paddock is a distinguished professorial lecturer of environmental law at the George Washington University Law School and currently a visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute, where he is managing director of the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. He previously served as Associate Dean for the Environmental Law Studies at George Washington University Law School from 2017 to 2007 to 2019, and was Director of Environmental Legal Studies at Pace University's Elizabeth Haub School of Law from 2002 to 2007. His research has focused recently on private environmental governance, environmental compliance and enforcement, environmental justice, many aspects of energy law, citizen environmental science, climate change litigation, public participation, and materials conservation. He is currently secretary and a member of the Executive Council of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Environmental Law, and the Academic Advisory Group on Energy for International Bar Associations, the International Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, Resources, and Infrastructure Law. Prior to his work in academia, from 78 until 99, Lee was an assistant attorney general with the Minnesota Attorney General's Office, where he served as director of environmental policy for 13 years, as manager of the office's Agricultural and Natural Resources Division, and as a member of the Executive Committee. He has been named to several national panels, including the Aspen Institute's series on environment in the 21st century and the American National Standard Institute's ISO 14,000 Environmental Management Systems Council. He was a senior consultant for the National Academy of Public Administration for 8 years. Professor Paddock, clerk for the Judge Donald Lay of the U.S. Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. He received his law degree from the University of Iowa Law School and his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan. As you can tell from his introduction, Professor Paddock has been a leader in many facets of environmental law, and someone I've always respected and looked up to in the academic world, and someone who bridges the academic and world of real policy and impacts. So I'm going to turn it over to him in a moment, and I want to let the audience know that we are being recorded, and that you may ask questions through the chat function or the question function. I think chat function might be easiest. I will be monitoring those questions, and I will then monitor the questions we can ask and have a discussion towards the end. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Professor.
Thank you, Victor. I'm going to get my screen up here, I hope. Okay, just a moment. Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here today to talk about this subject, which I've been working on probably over the last decade now, and I'll give you some reasons why I think it's so important. I don't mention in the slides, but it is also important to consider the relationship of this issue to Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is responsible consumption and production, because a lot of what I say here really fits very nicely with the direction of SDG 12. So we're talking about private environmental governance. It's, what the private sector can do. And part of the reason to talk about this is, or one of the things we have to think about is, why is this important? Well, certainly one of the reasons it's important is that in the United States, as Victor mentioned, our laws are changing very slowly. We've only had one major new environmental law in 25 years, and that's the law dealing with chemicals, new chemicals. There are a lot of serious environmental problems remain. Many of those are not well regulated, like non-point source water pollution, the protection of wetlands and habitat, materials use and product end of life. And really, the energy field is regulated very heavily, but not necessarily for its environmental consequences. And certainly in the US, climate change is one of those areas that is not well addressed. Globalization, as Professor Flatt mentioned, is a critical issue. Over the last 30 years, the US and the European Union have outsourced or offshored many of their environmental problems. And climate change is a great example of where outsourcing comes back home, but it's true in other areas as well. So in my view, this leaves a really important sustainability gap, and that is, what can we achieve through regulatory compliance versus what do we need for sustainability? So in my view, good environmental regulatory programs are of course necessary for sustainability, but not sufficient to assure that human activities remain within the carrying capacity of the earth. And so we have to ask the question, how can we fill that gap? So in thinking about that, as I mentioned, government regulation is a key motivator of behavior. It's a necessary part of any sustainability initiative, but we can't get to sustainability without thinking about public values and economics. So the more we can combine these three drivers of behavior, the more I think we have, the better possibility we have to achieve sustainable outcomes. And public values have changed dramatically over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years as environmental education has become much more part of the day-to-day routine. And those values lead to changes in economic incentives. Reputation, as I'll mention a little later, becomes critical for many public-facing businesses, and the reputation is all about economics for companies. So the combination of values and economics and government regulation driving in the same direction is where we need to be in order to achieve sustainable outcomes, whether it's in energy or other aspects of environment. So the consulting firm KPMG, in a study they did a couple of years ago, noted that sustainability or other areas related to corporate social responsibility can quickly derail a company's growth, although as many companies realize, successful CSR efforts can actually be an enabler of growth by helping build trust, by helping to build consumer trust. And the UN Global Compact, which is a voluntary organization developed by the UN, noted that what is increasingly clear is that traditional corporate environmental management approaches based largely on compliance and narrow risk assessment will not be sufficient to successfully navigate and address the challenges of the 21st century. We need more than regulation. We need the involvement of companies in order to achieve sustainability goals. As our colleague, Michael Vandenberg, who's at Vanderbilt University and really the expert on green supply chain, noted, at least in theory, the growth in environmental private contracting provides a means to ameliorate the environmental harms from international trade. Private environmental contracting is not a panacea. It is only one element of private governance, but an important element. And we'll talk more about green supply chain in a bit. The organization Businesses for Social Responsibility did a report called Future of Supply Chains 2025. And they noted a couple of important key forces for change. One of those is global climate change and resource scarcity. And in that regard, noted a need to embed climate smart supply chain planning as part of the work of businesses that want to be socially responsible. So energy is one of the areas where this has shown up in a particularly striking way in the last few years. And one aspect of that is corporate purchases of renewables. If you go back even before this chart to about 2011 or 2012, there were very few corporations that were specifying that they wanted 100% renewable energy to supply their businesses. Google was an early adapter in that regard, a few other Silicon Valley type companies. But as you note in 2018, and this certainly has expanded beyond that, a very wide range of companies are now specifying that they're going to operate within a time frame, 2025, 2030, 2035, on 100% renewable energy. And one of the important things is that companies moving into new locations and building new facilities are often telling the utilities they will not come to that location unless they can be supplied with 100% renewable energy. So that has had a big impact, especially the big folks like Google in their data centers, or Microsoft in their data centers, in areas where electric utilities had been somewhat reluctant to move towards renewables, in the southeast of the US, for example, where companies have had to develop plans for renewable energy, electric companies, if they were going to attract major new industries. And this same trend, with a very similar timeline, has occurred in Europe. So one of the more recent commitments, this is Target Company, and I think what you're seeing there are solar panels on one of their distribution facilities. Target has committed that 80% of their suppliers will set science-based reduction targets for both Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2023. Target itself will operate its facilities with 100% renewable energy by 2030. These kinds of commitments by companies are having a major impact on renewable energy, which was originally pushed by state renewable portfolio standards. Those were very important in getting utilities to move to build renewable energy facilities. But the big driving force now is not government regulation. It is the corporate supply chains requiring renewable energy.
Lee, this is just to interrupt you 1 second. Before you go on, could you define for our audience, all of them may not know the difference between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 reductions?
Sure, and help me out on this. Scope 1 is, as I understand it, sort of the direct emissions of greenhouse gases from a facility. Scope 2 emissions are sort of indirect emissions. So they're using electricity, and so it's their electric energy supplier. Scope 3, which has long been thought to be a very difficult area, is reducing emissions from the supply chain. That means that you have to have contract specifications or other ways of dealing with it. The federal government is required actually to look at a lot of Scope 3 greenhouse gas reductions under federal law, but that's the distinction as I understand it. So one of the more recent major commitments in this regard is Walmart with its Gigaton project. Project Gigaton is designed to inspire Walmart suppliers to reduce greenhouse gases and avoid 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions from their value chain by 2030. Again, we'll talk a little more about reputation later, but customer demands and reputation and public values are really the drivers behind this. Cost savings also. So most of what Walmart does is about cost savings, but a lot of it is also about their public image. And so you can see how that commitment to greenhouse gas reduction could be important to the company for that reason, and is going to have a big impact on electric suppliers. Investors are playing a big role in this, and that may be in risk management and also maybe in customer pressure and their own reputation. So task force on climate related financial disclosures has been active. A number of banks, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, HSBC have committed to not invest in coal. And very recently in January 2020, BlackRock, the biggest fund manager in the world, vowed to divest of all thermal coal investments. And just very recently, in the last month, the New York State Pension Fund, one of the biggest pension funds in the world, along with the California Fund, has said it will drop fossil fuel investments within 5 years, which is a pretty dramatic change. So you can see the impacts on the energy field as these issues become public values issues, they become investment issues. It's a really important change. So as I mentioned earlier, reputation plays a key role here, and Ernst & Young did a study a few years ago noting that between 30 and 50% of a company's value is intangible, not warehouses, not inventory. It's mostly corporate reputation. And if you're a publicly facing company, that can be a very powerful motivator to change the way you behave. BP saw it with the BP Horizon oil spill. Volkswagen saw it with the diesel scandal. These things tend to fade out over a 2 or 3 year period, but they can have a dramatic impact on a company for a significant period of time. I had a Volkswagen diesel that was part of that recall, and I no longer own Volkswagens and probably will not buy one in the near future. So that reputational impact can be very long lasting and plays an important role in green supply chain today. So what kind of standards are out there that companies can look to? Well, one of the oldest is what are called the series principles. They were developed by a nonprofit organization after the Exxon Valdez spill. So this is not entirely new. It goes back close to some 30 years with these ideas of principles for environmental conduct. In the financial sector, there's the Equator Principles, which are designed to ensure more socially and environmental assessment occurs in financing decisions. One of the more interesting ones, what is the Responsible Business Alliance work on electronic supply chain and in conflict minerals. So this was originally called the Electronics Industry. I'm going to forget the word. I think it was Electronic Industry Ethics Coalition or something like that. I don't remember exactly. They are now broader than electronics industry, but it was designed to deal with the reputational problem that and the customer concerns about conflict minerals in electronic equipment like computers and televisions. And it developed a supply chain process, a chain of custody process where you could look at minerals that were used in those devices from the mine all the way up to the final use in the computer and be able to certify, for example, that smelters were conflict mineral free. In fact, Apple went through this process and by 2015, they were able to certify that all of the smelters that supplied it with tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold were audited by a third party to assure that they were conflict mineral free. And of course, these kinds of minerals are widely used in the energy industry as well. Public procurement is another area that can be very important in terms of supply chain. And so, for example, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 requires that 7.5% of federal energy procurement must come from renewable sources. Interestingly, the Obama administration had elaborated on that requirement in an executive order. The Trump administration repealed the Obama executive order, but specifically left in place the statutory requirement. Of course, they couldn't repeal it by executive order, but they did leave it in place. And I expect that the Biden administration will use government procurement as a vehicle to drive towards its goal of 100% clean energy and zero emission vehicles. There is a group that's not been very active with the federal government recently because of the Trump administration priorities, but an interesting group called the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, which is designed to work between the federal government and other major procurement organizations to do more sustainable procurement. All right, so contract law is an important part of this since it's green supply chain, and supply chain contracting is a huge issue. So for example, with Walmart, they purchase in 2014, which is some time ago, over $470 billion, or their sales were over $470 billion. They have a worldwide supply chain. Unlike any individual government, Walmart can tell its suppliers in China and Thailand and Bangladesh or wherever what it will accept, and it has adopted very detailed greenhouse gas reduction policies and chemical policies that ban things like formaldehyde and toluene. So the power to change environmental outcomes around the world is in the hands of companies with big supply chains. And so there are a lot of tools that can be used in this process, and they can focus on things like energy efficiency. Those tools include certifications, capacity building tools, reporting and whistleblowing requirements, and auditing and consequences for poor outcomes. We did a study that was published in an article in the University of Arkansas about 2 years ago, looking at the Fortune 50 companies and their green supply chain practices. Actually, we looked at the Fortune 100 companies, and 58 out of the top 100 companies had green supply chain requirements that they discussed on their website, so they were public about that. Those goals in their green supply chains can vary significantly. So for example, some of them can be very soft. Albertson supplier sustainability goals and expectation encourage suppliers to take action, whereas other companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever require, for example, commitments to deforestation or specific cuts in environmental footprint, which Unilever does by date certain. Many of these companies have internal codes of conduct and standards that look very much like government regulations. So this is an example from Target for its water stewardship specification, which requires companies to identify and characterize and inventory all their wastewater streams and to install and maintain appropriately sized wastewater treatment systems. So you can see kind of the regulatory analog here developing in the private sector setting. Some companies rely on third-party certification, and as many of you know, there are a lot of those out there. I mentioned the conflict-free smelter certification. Energy Star is sometimes specified. LEED requirements for buildings are sometimes used as part of green supply chain requirements. And EPA maintains something called the Green Power Partnership, which is a voluntary program which certifies partners that are undertaking energy efficiency steps. I'll mention ISO 14000 just briefly. It is an environmental management system approach, which is, again, voluntary, set up by the International Standards Organization. It's been around for about 20 years. It can help identify goals for companies to move towards in energy and lots of other areas. There is no specific enforcement mechanism, but if a company portrays itself or is ISO 14000 certified and then fails to carry out its environmental obligations, it does run a significant reputational risk. A number of companies do capacity building for the suppliers. So for example, Walmart has its Responsible Sourcing Academy, which is, as the note says, it uses root cause analysis, methodology, and procedures to teach factory management to proactively identify non-compliance issues and develop a systematic approach to continuous improvement. And if companies have had some poor audit outcomes, they're required to go through their Responsible Sourcing Academy. Some companies use whistleblower requirements. So PepsiCo has its Speak Up program and a hotline. Walmart and Microsoft also have whistleblower programs to allow employees at suppliers to raise concerns with the big companies. And more companies are developing detailed auditing requirements to ensure that the specifications are actually carried out, and Walmart does that. They use third-party audits in a variety of fields. I will skip through that a little bit. Target provides that all vendors and factories producing Target label products have to participate in the compliance program. Their audits are unannounced, so that, again, they look very much like a government inspection at that point. And if there are poor audit results, companies can be disqualified as a supplier. I want to turn then briefly to a couple of other issues, and then hopefully we can pause for some questions. An important related development. It's not exactly the same thing as green supply chain management, but the idea of circular economy is becoming more discussed in a lot of large companies. In the EU, there is actually a directive around circular economy. The idea here is that our typical economic model in the past has been what folks have characterized as a linear economy, which is characterized by dig it up, use it, and dispose of it. Circular economy, the idea is to disrupt that model and first of all, dig up less, use less. Whatever you use, try to design products so that they can be reused or remanufactured, and then find ways of repurposing materials at the end of the economic life of a material. This is important because with the size of the population we have and the increasing growth of consumer classes around the world, we're using materials and disposing of materials at truly unsustainable rates. And this is recognized by SDG 12 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So interestingly, this idea of circular economy has kind of reached into the energy field. The National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado has a 10-year vision of the future around energy circular economy. So there are a couple of issues here. One is more efficient use of energy. Well, actually three. More efficient production of energy, so there's less waste and less pollution. More efficient use of energy, so we don't need as much. But importantly, especially with renewable energy, what do we do at the end of life cycle for things like solar panels? It's been a small issue in the past, but as we rapidly expand renewable energy, windmills and solar panels, we need to think, especially for solar panels, what is their fate? Can they be remanufactured? Because there are aspects of the solar panels where there may be hazardous materials. So NREL is starting to think about circular economy and energy in important ways. And that same thing is true in this one electric company in the Netherlands that I took a brief look at. And they too want to look very carefully at recovery of byproducts and waste and maximize product use and prioritize renewable inputs. So circular economy is reaching into the energy field. So kind of to wrap up, one of the kind of some of the big issues here, the challenges ahead, are really understanding how effective these green supply chain mechanisms are in producing desirable sustainability outcomes. We're maybe 10 years into the major green supply chain efforts. They haven't been studied all that much to really understand how effective those green supply chain practices are. We also need to understand which approaches are most effective. We now have some big companies, Walmart and Target and GE and many others, Unilever. We can begin to look at how effective the green supply chains are in changing outcomes. We need to look at what the oversight mechanisms will be that can best assure compliance, what the audit mechanisms are. And I think as we go ahead, especially with circular economy issues starting to come into play, one of the critical issues is what should be the role of government in developing and encouraging, monitoring, and perhaps even relying on private supply chain and private supply chain enforcement. And I think especially with materials use and circular economy, the time might be right in the Biden administration to think about a national dialogue on materials conservation, circular economy, where government and industry and NGOs can work together to find new answers to really important problems. So Victor, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we have a few questions, and I have some questions as well. But you started to answer one of the questions in your last slide. One of the questions was a comment about the push in the UK to have the government try to enforce some of these green supply chain management, some standards, right, for private companies that are there. I know there's also been a push in the European Union, and to a lesser extent, let's just say with financial reporting, we've seen a little bit of a push for that in the United States. So that really gets to a really big and important question. How do you see the role of government enhancing, pushing the private sector? Or, I mean, because a lot of what we've been reading about historically has been the private sector kind of took the lead in some ways because government was not there, and it was being pushed by things besides government, as you point out, right. Reputation. So yes. What is that role of the government here? How can it be most effectively deployed?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So one effort that was actually started in the Clinton administration was to recognize leadership companies for going beyond compliance. And that effort went into the Bush administration And there was a concern, I think, by environmental organizations that the standards were not high enough to recognize companies as leadership companies. So one way that one could conceive of a government supporting green supply chain is to recognize the leadership companies in that regard, but it's a fraught area. It requires a lot of time and effort to identify who the leaders are, and there's often a lot of dispute about that. So I'm not sure that kind of recognizing leaders, at least formally recognizing leaders, is the best way to do it. Information exchange, helping smaller companies that are subject to supply chain requirements comply, technical assistance programs, all could be a role that government can play in sort of spreading the gospel. So they don't have to recognize companies, but they can recognize good practices and try to spread those. It's a, taking it one step further, like you're suggesting UK might want to do with actually requiring green supply chain practices, I think is another fraught area. You could potentially stifle innovation by doing that. You might get a lot of resistance. It could take momentum away. On the other hand, there might be some things, I think there are some things, like extended producer responsibility requirements, which are not just supporting company green supply chain, but saying, as the EU has, if you've got electronics products that are a problem for waste, you've got to take those products back, or they've got to be designed to be disassembled, and you have to have a disassemble process. The US has been far behind the EU in those kinds of extended producer responsibility requirements. And I think it's probably time for the US to think seriously about places where supply chain requirements are essential public health and environmental protection requirements. So I would tend to look more towards those kinds of targeted supply chain issues for a regulatory response.
That's interesting. When I was thinking about and your response, but also thinking about this on my own, how government, what government is most effective at doing in this context, it struck me that eventually you sort of came back to government finding ways to enhance the faster response of the private market, like through information, through reputation, or even if you have a general thing that you have to be responsible for your product, the life cycle of the product or the packaging, that still leaves to the company sort of, or tries to leave the concept of the innovation, right, to figure out the way to do it. So I think it's a really interesting perspective. We have another question, and I think you could probably answer this, and it's very important, and that is the relationship between a company's environmental responsibilities and then their other social and equity responsibilities. The question basically is, do companies who are committed to sort of environmental sustainability also tend to show a commitment toward social and equitable sustainability, human rights, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think, I don't study human rights that much, but I know that the same kinds of supply chain requirements have been developed by a number of companies in the human rights context. And, it shows up in child labor, it shows up in working conditions, it shows up in wages and hours of work. And the same kinds of reputational forces push companies to do that. So while I haven't looked at what Walmart or Target or Nike or GE does in the human rights area, my assumption and my recollection is that at least several of those kinds of companies, Unilever, have adopted similar supply chain human rights specifications for their suppliers.
Well, and in fact, the moniker, which I don't know if we talked about today, but the ESG moniker, environmental social governance, kind of recognizes, I think, that interrelationship. Um, I have, the importance of a company's reputation. You look at this as a part of the larger theme of private environmental governance, and that, of course, has many angles. One of those is the demand for better compliance from customers and from investors. So we sort of skated above this a little bit. Some of those investors are looking to ask companies to do a better job because of financial risks. Let's say the financial risk of climate change, and the interrelated. But there's an interrelated nature between consumer preference, right, and financial risk. If you're trying to please your consumers, this goes back to your slide about reputation being 30 to 50% of a company's value. If you're responding to consumers, in some ways that seems to also deal with financial risk. And I wonder if you have any theories about why we're seeing so much of this and so much quick growth of it now. Is it because of the growth of social media? Is it so customers can organize better? Or is it the dearth of government action, which you noted at the beginning of your talk?
Yeah, so I think there's several reasons. Certainly, I think some of it occurs because government hasn't occupied some of the field. Some of it occurs because we're much more aware of international issues, and that's a social media phenomena. So if you look at palm oil, for example, and the effort to deal with deforestation from palm oil plantations, and the social media aspect of that is the orangutan that everybody sees on social media from Indonesia, who is losing its habitat because of palm oil. Well, I did some work in this area, kind of looking at deforestation issues. And one of the organizations that probably almost no one is aware of is something called the Consumer Goods Forum. It's made up of, I think, about 200 of the world's largest consumer goods companies. So Tesco and Unilever, Colgate-Palmolive, Walmart, many others are part of the Consumer Goods Forum. And actually was at Rio Plus 20 at the US Pavilion a few years ago when they made a presentation about their social goals. And one of those was to set a date to end deforestation related to palm oil and some other paper and palm oil for all of the companies that were part of the Consumer Goods Forum. What you have, they've got billions and billions of worldwide sales, millions of worldwide employees. They can have an impact. And, while we haven't ended deforestation from palm oil, there at least has been a concerted effort around the world to certify that palm oil is not responsible for deforestation. So, that's a social media issue. It's a consumer awareness issue. It becomes a financial issue when, there might be boycotts of your product if you're on the wrong side of that issue. Even companies like Cargill, which is a privately held company and doesn't have to worry too much about reputation, became very much engaged in that ending deforestation discussion.
Thanks. We have one question about are we moving sort of toward maybe uniform or global standards? And this is a pretty big question, and just sort of for our audience's benefits, it seems that in these standard settings and reviews, we have different organizations that play somewhat different roles. So some of these, and these are generally nonprofits or they may be business associations, some of these tend to analyze how good a company is doing at whatever sustainable goal they've said, like GRI. That's a kind of a global research institute that looks at that. And then we have organizations that are trying to come up with uniform standards of measurement to help analyze how well companies are doing. So, like SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, that seems to be growing in importance. Are we moving, do you think, towards some kind of uniformity? I know that looking back 10 years ago until now, you do see more organizations that are attempting to provide measurements. They seem to be jockeying, right, to be the leader in determining what is sustainable and what isn't.
Yeah, it's a big question. There are certainly areas where we're seeing uniformity. So the group I couldn't remember the exact name before was the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition. So it's interesting by the name by itself, calling it the Citizenship Coalition. And I think they're now a pretty uniform standard that people who are looking at conflict minerals, Apple, HP, any of those companies, or can follow in order to be able to say that their products are conflict free. That's pretty niche. The same thing is true with the Forest Stewardship Council. Last I heard, about 1/10 of the world's forests have been certified in that way. But again, it's pretty niche. And palm oil has its certification process. So we're seeing more niche-based uniform standards being developed. And then obviously we've seen standards like ISO and the environmental management systems, and ISO has a number of other environmental standards that I'm less familiar with that have developed in the last few years. And it may be that that's as far as we can go, because once you get out of the niche, if you're trying to look at Walmart's supply chain, I mean, how in the world do you find a standard that would work for a company that sources probably millions of products from hundreds of countries, or dozens and dozens of countries? So I'm not sure how far you can go with standardization. I certainly don't see it as a legal kind of treaty-based standard anytime in the near future, given the success of treaties in the past. But I do think people want ways to be able to say, I'm doing the right thing, and maybe we can get beyond niche products to do that. We've tried things like the Blue Angel program in Germany, which certifies lots of products, but again, there it's a kind of it doesn't cover the whole universe. And I don't know in the energy field, you probably know better than I whether there are standards being developed there that we certainly see them again in a niche way with Energy Star and other kinds of conservation or efficiency measures.
Well, and I think you're also right that even if you were to be able to move to some uniform way of measuring products across the board, you still have to have multiple categories. So I know you've probably seen this in some corporate sustainability programs. Often they may use the UN sustainable goals in, they're like 16 and try to reach those, and those, but then you still have multiplicities of things to measure and that sort of thing. I think we have time for one more question, and there's a question about, and it's an important one. What role do NGOs play in this whole thing? And I think it's an interesting question because there's so many different kinds of NGOs. For one thing, I mean, ELI is an NGO, and you're working there, but then there are some that are more niche. There are some that technically are NGOs, but they may be sort of conglomerations of memberships with corporations or various other things. Some are consumer pushing, some are shareholder pushing. So to sum us up, what do you feel the role of NGOs are in this whole picture?
Yeah, so a lot of roles. So in the deforestation context, for example, one of the worst deforestation companies in Indonesia, when they changed their practice, they worked with Rainforest, I think it was Rainforest Action Coalition or one of the rainforest groups to do the auditing. So collaboration between NGOs and companies where the companies are making real progress and the NGO can certify that, audit it and be a sort of a public, yes, they're doing the right thing is one mechanism. There's always going to be a role for the unattached NGO critic that needs to be out there to identify problems. Environmental Defense Fund is a good example of a company that's up on the front. They do collaborations with industry. They build some of these kinds of supply chain processes from the ground up. So I don't think there's just one role. There's a whole variety of roles. One of the interesting examples I saw early on was I think it was Rainforest Action Coalition. One of the rainforest groups figured, not very much certified sustainable timber was being sold in the US. And so they threatened Home Depot with essentially a Greenpeace type actions if Home Depot didn't change its practices. And, that kind of campaign resulted in Home Depot agreeing to begin stocking certified sustainable timber. So there are both collaborative roles and pushing roles and developing roles, I think, that NGOs can play. And the bottom line, I think, is it's important for as much as possible to find ways of building collaborations here between NGOs, companies, and government for us to be successful. It's again, all of the drivers need to be driving in the same direction.
And one question that just came up through chat, of course, is something we can't fully address now. But is this all greenwashing? I mean, we know that private corporations, obviously, you have an incentive to want your consumers and your shareholders and government and NGOs to think you're doing the right thing. And NGOs can sometimes have a role in monitoring that.
Yeah, so just to briefly on that point, one of the things I did in the Minnesota Attorney General's office is participate in the case against Mobil Oil when in the late 1990s when they were advertising their recyclable garbage bags. And we said, yeah, biodegradable garbage bag. And we said, yeah, sure, 1,000 years, a couple of 1,000 years. And we brought a consumer fraud, false and deceptive advertising case. Greenwashing is out there. It can always happen. I felt there was a lot of greenwashing in the late 1990s. I think there's a lot of different motivations driving companies today. Sure, there's greenwashing still, but I think there are a lot of important work that companies are doing that is legitimate and that that government can't easily or maybe at all produce on its own.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful part of this series. Thank you, Dr. Nzaou, for hosting this and putting this all together. I want to thank our audience. This will be recorded and posted online. Thank you, Lee, very much. It was great to hear from you and hear about your work. And that will be all for today. And you will be receiving notices of our future programs and look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.